It's not what you've been told, and I will prove it to you today. Hello humans, and welcome to another episode of Gen X Gamer. Today we will deal with a 40-year mystery, a 40-year debate that some of us have had in the Gen X community for a long time, especially those of us who were ColecoVision fans pre the NES. We've known this for a long time, right? But like my old Italian grandfather used to say that was on the wrong side of the war, don't trust the history books. They were written by the victors. But that's a whole nother conversation, not for this channel. Regardless, guys, look, when it comes to this, there's many things that we saw as Gen Xers. Those of us who enjoyed the game, those of us who played the game, that when we saw Legend of Zelda, we said, what? And I will prove it to you today. The origins of the Legend of Zelda are not what we are told, right? And I'm going to present to you facts, right? I'm going to take you through evidence. I'm going to take you through pictures. I'm going to take you through timelines. And I'm going to make my case on why the Legend of Zelda was inspired not by Miyamoto's garden, but by another game.
Let's get right into this. Look, guys, I'm going to make the case even though it's a circumstantial one, and it has to be circumstantial because nobody's going to come out and say, hey, yeah, I got inspiration from this game in order to make the Legend of Zelda. Can you imagine what kind of money is going to be involved in that kind of thing? But let me tell you about Alcazar, the Forgotten Fortress, the lost blueprint of Hyrule. You know, in 1985, Activision released a game that few players remember because it was right at the end. Alcazar, the Forgotten Fortress. It appeared in the ColecoVision and the ColecoVision Atom computer. It was a top-down adventure. It was a kingdom of castles, a hero seeking a crown in a sprawling land of traps, treasures, and danger. Hello. 1 year later, Nintendo released The Legend of Zelda. The two games are from different worlds, different companies, even different continents. But the structures of these games, guys, they align like stars in the same constellation. Coincidence? I think not. I want to say that this is an uncredited influence that has been lost in time because to the victors go the spoils, right? There was a game before Hyrule. Alcazar came first, and it was developed by Tom Lowry. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. If not, excuse me, I have an accent. And it was published by Activision. It placed players on a map of 22 castles scattered across a kingdom. Each playthrough generated a new layout. Routes shifted. Enemy patterns changed. Tools had to be found across pits to reach new areas. Right? So you had to cross a pit, you needed a tool. You want to reach a new area, you had to get a tool. Inside each fortress, players face multi-floor labyrinths filled with traps, locked doors, lurking enemies. The goal was to survive each castle and reach the final fortress on the far side of the map, the Alcazar itself. Released in 1985, this was before Nintendo's entertainment system came out, or even the standardized term action-adventure became a part of our language. The ColecoVision was already fading in the market, so this was released at the end of the ColecoVision, but Activision still put it out. They still put out Alcazar on both on the console and the computer variant, which was the Atom back then. It went mostly unnoticed, except for like specialty magazines, that were into Dungeons and Dragons and that kind of thing. But if you look, it really has familiar architecture. Look closer at the mechanics. If you haven't done so, go play the game. Right? Emulate it however you can get it, in order so you can get a feel for it. The structure mirrors what Nintendo would bring to the world months later, or a year later in this case. It was a central overworld linking a network of dungeons, item-gated exploration. You needed the hook tool in Alcazar that allowed passage across gaps, much like Zelda's ladder raft. Multi-floor interiors. The slow build-up towards a single climatic fortress. Players who compare the footage from both games notice the same cadence and movement, screen-by-screen transitions, fixed-room combat, a steady rhythm of discovery, danger, and relief. And that really is the formula there, guys. Discovery, danger, and relief. Even the randomization in Alcazar anticipates the sense of adventure that Zelda would perfect. Every journey felt new, even when the goal never changed. Now, the name behind the fortress, this is very important here. This is actually one of the strongest links. The word Alcazar means fortress or castle in Spanish. In its most famous real-world example, it's Alcazar of Segovia, the 12th century stone castle, which I'm showing you a picture of here, and it's above central Spain. With turrets and towers shaped like the prow of a ship, it has inspired countless works of fantasy and architecture. You know, most famously the castle, for example, that they use in Disney's, right? Snow White, those kind of things. People that travel cite it, right? People that go and travel abroad cite it as the inspiration for Nintendo. This castle lies between two rivers, right? So it's around water. And I'm showing you the pictures right now of both. One of them is a 3D render of the actual castle. The other thing that you're seeing is a rendition that somebody made, and I'm going to put a link for those of you out there who want to look at it. This is a rendition in Unreal 5, right, of Hyrule Castle. Now, the Happy Horizon in 2023 lists the Segovia Alcazar as one of the 3 world inspirations of Zelda's architecture. Right? They actually put it in print when many people have been saying for a long time. The name of Activision's game, the release before Zelda, draws from the same source. They do. The link between the Spanish castle Activision's title and Nintendo's later Fortress of Hyrule is not proven, of course, it's just an observation that people make. But the curious alignment along with the gameplay, right, really leaves very little doubt to coincidence, right? Is it coincidence? I don't think so, not in that specific time. I would say it's more of a missing citation. For those of you who don't know, for those of you who are younger, let me give you a little bit of a history lesson. We invented video games here in the US, and Japan was famous, absolutely famous for cloning everything without copyright, right? There were several instances that you can go back to in history, where, they would make a game and these guys would copy it, call it something else. It was a Wild West back then, and you could just pretty much make anything you wanted and go sue themselves afterwards. Like ColecoVision and Atari. Like famously, Shinobi used a bunch of properties that they weren't supposed to that to take it out of the game. All of those things happened back then. It was a different environment than it is today. So don't judge this by today's atmosphere of copyright. Back then, there was no such things. A lot of things that we have today weren't in place back then. Now, no one at Nintendo has ever mentioned Alcazar. Shigeru Miyamoto has long explained The Legend of Zelda is a digital reflection of his childhood explorations of Kyoto's caves and forests. He cites the joy of discovery. He points to Japanese influences such as the Tower of Druaga and Hydlide. But, guys, he doesn't ever name Western sources when the game has a completely European feel, right? He never mentions Western sources, but he never denies them. Have you ever seen this type of castle in Japan? Of course not. You can't rewrite history, right? Copyright law really makes these kind of acknowledgments impossible, especially at Nintendo. Activision owned Alcazar's rights, and Nintendo fiercely is protective of their own intellectual properties. As we know, the Nintendo Ninjas, they would have really very little incentive in connecting their flagship adventure to a title from another publisher like Activision. But the developers in the 1980s were a really small community, right? So I'm taking you back in time where everybody was getting quote-unquote inspiration from each other. Console designers routinely studied other releases that would buy the consoles and, open them up to see what's going on. And in the case of the ColecoVision and NES, a link was already established because ColecoVision was doing the arcade releases of Nintendo here in the US. Import copies circulated back in the day through programmers, journalists that would give each other copies of things. And it would be more than plausible for copies of this game to have reached the shores of Japan, of course. The ColecoVision had reached Japan through niche distributors. A designer as curious as Miyamoto could easily have seen Alcazar. Very easy. But let's lay down here more, solid ground for my assertions here. The design DNA. We're going to look at element, perspective, and other things, right? So if you look at an element like the perspective, top down for Alcazar, top down for Zelda. Overworld map, node-based castles linked by roads. And dare I say, these node-linked castles were used in other Nintendo games, but whatever. Continuous world map for Zelda. Dungeons, multi-room, multi-floor fortresses, multi-room dungeons. Items to progress to other areas. You had hook, guns, keys. In Zelda, you had sword, bombs, ladder, and raft. The goal, to rescue the crown from the final fortress in Alcazar. In Zelda was rescue the princess and defeat Ganon. A save feature was done on the Atom. It supported a save. And so did the Famicom disk system. They also supported a save. Royal Castles explorations for Alcazar. Royal Castle exploration for Zelda. Coincidence? I think not. Mechanically, both games reward methodical progress. That really is one of the branding of the game. The player explores, acquires tools, and returns stronger. Both demand spatial awareness and patience. You can say that of both games. It is the same loop of mastery, guys, that defines the modern adventure genre. It's that same loop, it's the same recipe. There's also a calendar problem here. Timing really matters. Alcazar reached stores in 1985. They were out there. There were cartridges out there. The Legend of Zelda didn't release until a year later. Zelda's development was in progress when Alcazar released. It was already in store shelves. That means that Alcazar existed publicly during the design phase of the Zelda franchise. No documentation actually proves it. No, there's no cross-references. Again, you wouldn't be nuts to do that because of copyright infringement. But could you say that it's plausible that they got inspired on this game? Absolutely. Right? In other words, Alcazar was already on the shelves in Japan while Zelda was being made. Now today, Alcazar only survives in videos like this, retrospectives and stuff like that, because it was never a big seller. It was released on a system that was dying, right? And I'll put, some references to some articles where people have made the same observations, like King of Crabs in 2023, right? And they write, in some ways, progenitor of the early Zelda games was Alcazar, right? Players on retro forums say a lot of the same things. The resemblance is too hard to ignore. Yes, the game, obscurity protects it, in mystery back then that nobody knows it, right? Few have seen the original hardware. Its black backgrounds and blocky characters, stone quarters look primitive next to Hyrule's vibrant greens. But beneath that simplicity, guys, beneath all the restrictions that they had on that hardware, the structure feels decades ahead of its time. It really does. A lot of the things were there that made, games that later on use those mechanics feel a lot better. The castle at the edge of memory. History often forgets the first version of an idea. This is why pictures are so powerful. This is the reason I'm giving you a model of the castle and the rendering in Unreal Engine for you guys to compare. You guys can go there, right? But there really is a link here. For every masterpiece that defines a genre, there's always been a prototype out there. These are prototypes that will never reach the spotlight, right? Alcazar, I propose to you, is one of them. The clues all align, guys. You have an overworld of castles, dungeon exploration through item progression, a royal fortress named from the same Spanish source that inspired Hyrule's, that, as many people say, even though, of course, Nintendo will never acknowledge this, and a release date within the creation of Zelda. Coincidence? Not for me, perhaps, but I don't think so. Not at that time. Not with the way the market was then. Not with the way Nintendo operated back then, right? And a lot of people, romanticize Nintendo back in the day. Nintendo is ruthless and always has been ruthless, right? When it comes to their properties. When a player powers on Alcazar, the Forgotten Fortress today, they see the shadow of something familiar. They will. You will. Go ahead and do it. Emulate it. Go get a cartridge, whatever you can, but go ahead and play it before you make an opinion. A lone adventurer pushing through danger towards a distant castle, one screen at a time. Long before Link raised his sword, another nameless hero had already crossed that threshold, and he crushed it. Somewhere between the Forgotten Coleco cartridge and the birth of Hyrule lies a connection that I might never be able to fully prove because it's all circumstantial evidence. But let me tell you, if you play the game, you're going to feel it, right? Don't believe what people say. Believe what your eyes see. Go ahead and play the game. All right, guys, I'm making my case. I'm going to put references for all this stuff down below in my Substack article where you can go and read it. I'm going to publish all this as I'm making this video. It's too much to put on YouTube, there's just too much stuff. But if you actually want to read the article, and go look at all the references, you can do it there, and all the links are going to be there. All right, let's wrap it up.
Well, guys, that's my case. I can hear you out saying, well, this is it's just circumstantial evidence for those of you Zelda fans. And don't get me wrong, I love Nintendo. I love The Legend of Zelda. But the truth is the truth. Right? There's too many coincidences here. Do you believe in coincidences, or do you believe in people staying quiet because of copyright laws?